In 5 weeks, Canadians will go to the ballot box. And in the meantime, federal leaders will make their case and lay out their party platforms. This will be Liberal leader Mark Carney's first federal election. Here's what he had to say about the challenges ahead as he launched his campaign on Sunday.
There is so much more to do to secure Canada, to invest in Canada, to build Canada, to unite Canada. That's why I'm asking for a strong, positive mandate from my fellow Canadians. I've just requested that the Governor-General dissolve Parliament and call an election for April 28th, and she has agreed.
Now, none of this is surprising, of course, given that the Liberal minority government likely would have faced a non-confidence vote upon returning to Parliament. Saskatchewan has been almost entirely blue in federal politics since the Conservative Party first ran a slate of candidates in 2004 in Saskatchewan. It's been all blue since 2019. But with boundary redistribution, analysts say one Saskatchewan seat could be in play for other parties. But also, the polls have changed a lot since Justin Trudeau announced his resignation in January, making this a really interesting election to watch. Today, we're going to hear from supporters of the Liberal, NDP, and Conservative parties, as well as a former Sask Party MLA turned consultant for a political strategy company based in Calgary. So today, we're talking about the role of the West in the federal election. Do you think the Prairie provinces can help steer any of the debate on the road to Election Day? We want to hear your thoughts. 1-800-716-2221 or email us bluesky@cbc.ca. Okay, before we get into the politics and the policies and the partisanship, let's get into the numbers. Watching the polls very closely is Eric Grenier. He is an analyst and writer at the rit.ca. He's also running CBC's poll tracker this election. I only ever get to talk to you at election time, and it's always very exciting. Much like the provincial election here in Saskatchewan, this one has gotten very interesting, Eric. Thanks for coming on the show.
Absolutely has, yeah.
Okay, we're less than 24 hours into this. What's the latest? Well, I guess we're more than 24 hours if we want to be technical. What's the latest polling data showing us?
Well, it's showing that this race is far, far closer than I think any of us expected it to be at the beginning of the year. Back then, the Conservatives were leading by 20, 25 points in the polls, and the NDP was even in a position to maybe pass the Liberals in those national polls. Now we are in a neck-and-neck race. The poll tracker that I'm running for the CBC has the Liberals narrowly ahead of the Conservatives, but really it's about a 1-point gap between the two parties. The NDP has fallen back into a distant third place. They look to be in a lot of trouble. But we have this national tie, or effectively a tie between the Liberals and the Conservatives. But because of how the vote breaks down at the seat level, as we saw in the last two elections, the Liberals don't need as many votes as the Conservatives to win more seats. And right now, that's where they probably stand. That if an election were held today, it'd be nearly tied in the vote, but the Liberals would win the most seats and maybe even a majority government.
Talk to me about the polls and what's shifted in opinion, because polls isn't just about who you like the most. It's also about the issues. What's shifted since January 6th when Justin Trudeau said, I don't want to be prime minister anymore?
Well, one is that people aren't mad at the prime minister. I think that is one of the biggest shifts we've seen. Justin Trudeau's approval ratings were, pretty low when he resigned. Mark Carney, his numbers are actually much higher, and his positive ratings are better than certainly Trudeau's were when he resigned. But I think what has really shifted the most has been the perception of what is the main issue in Canada. At the beginning of the year, it was still cost of living was the top issue and affordability. Now it is Donald Trump and the tariffs. And I think that has really shifted public opinion, not only when it comes to politics, but it's shifted public opinion in travel habits and buying habits. And so it's also had a shift on how we're viewing politics. Even the cost of living issue, which is still polling very high, is tied up in those threats of tariffs, that if the tariffs come in and if they hurt the Canadian economy, that will increase the cost of living. So I think everything is really linking back to Donald Trump and the White House in this campaign. And I think that's really something that we didn't think was going to be the case, back in the fall when it looked like the Liberals were on track for a catastrophic defeat.
When it comes to elections, we don't elect leaders, we elect parties who have picked their leaders. But leaders are the ones who drive the campaigns. What is your polling telling you at this point about the leaders of the parties?
Yeah, the polls that have been published over the last little while suggest that Mark Carney is the most popular leader. He generally polls ahead of Pierre Poilievre on preferred prime minister. His approval ratings are higher than Pierre Poilievre's, and his disapproval or negative ratings are lower than Pierre Poilievre. So we have a prime minister who is pretty popular, but still largely unknown. There's a lot of people who don't have very firm opinions about him. We have an opposition leader, the conservative leader, who his numbers have gotten a little worse over the little while. His momentum has really been negative over the last few weeks as his negatives have gone up. And then you have Jagmeet Singh of the New Democrats, who is in a far worse position than he was in the last election. His approval ratings are really going down, and it's part of the reason the NDP is struggling so much. If it is a two-horse race, those two horses are Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre. Carney right now has the advantage over Pierre Poilievre, but again, that first impression that he's going to be making to a lot of Canadians over the next little while, I think could be decisive.
You've touched on tariffs. You touched on cost of living. What are some of the other big ticket issues that Canadians are paying attention to through these campaigns?
I think there's other issues that are pretty important, like housing, healthcare. These are issues that always poll highly, and we see that now. But I really do think that the campaign is largely going to be about Donald Trump, and not necessarily him himself and what he's doing, but just how Canadians perceive the leaders and their ability to react to him. We saw in the Ontario election, which is the only election we've had in the shadow of these tariff threats. The other parties wanted to talk about healthcare. They wanted to talk about housing. But in the end, it was the Trump issue, the tariff issue, that decided that election. And I think that while there will be other issues at play during the campaign, I think that any day that Donald Trump says something about Canada, all those issues will just go straight out the window, and it'll all be about how the leaders are going to react to it and what they propose as their policy and their way to deal with the U.S. president.
Let's drill down on Saskatchewan. We know when it comes to federal leaders, Ralph Goodale held a long-time seat here in Regina, Wascana, ousted by Michael Cram in the last election. Saskatchewan swept entirely conservative blue last go-round. What are you seeing in terms of heading into this campaign in terms of support for different parties?
What we've seen is that there hasn't been enough change, I would say, to suggest that a lot of seats would change hands in the election. The Conservatives are still leading in the Prairies. We don't often have polling just for Saskatchewan, but when we do, the Conservative lead is usually far higher in Saskatchewan than it is in Manitoba. And in some polls, the Conservatives are actually falling behind in Manitoba. But in Saskatchewan, I think that it still looks like the Conservatives are very strongly positioned to win the seats in the rural South, that they should be able to hold their seats in Saskatoon and Regina. But if we do continue to see the Liberal polls start to rise in the Prairies, maybe there could be a surprise in one of the urban ridings. The northern riding in Desnethe, Missinippi, Churchill River, because of the change in the boundaries, where the area around Meadow Lake was detached and added to the Battlefords riding, it is primarily now a Indigenous riding, even more than it was before. And pretty much where all the Conservative voters live now live in a different riding. So the Liberals do seem like they would be the best position to win that seat. So doesn't look like a Conservative sweep across the board. But apart from that, there would need to still be a lot more change in the polls for there to be a change in the seats.
As far as polls and elections go, we know that polls do not always reflect the final result. What can you tell us about your observations on that over the last couple of elections?
Yeah, there's obviously been a few cases, and we see that especially in Saskatchewan, where the polls have sometimes missed a little bit of what's been going on. But overall, in national elections, federal campaigns, we haven't really seen that many errors. If you look at the last two campaigns, they both had the polls pretty much on the money, that it was a tight race between the Conservatives and the Liberals, but because the Liberals had better vote distribution across the country, they could win the most seats. So I think that is what we're looking at here, that the polls are pretty reliable at the national level. And for there to be the kind of error that would change the outcome of the election, it needs to be pretty significant. But, the fact that we have a close race right now between the Liberals and the Conservatives, that suggests that, you don't need to have a lot of change, and you don't need a lot of have a lot of error in the polls to change that outcome. So we'll see what's going to happen over the next 5 weeks. The polls are a spotlight, a snapshot. They certainly don't predict the future. But right now, if you're kind of scoring the game and it's the end of the first period, the Liberals do seem to be up a goal at least.
I like your sports analogies. We know Donald Trump ebbs and flows on policy. Does Donald Trump's ebb and flow have a potential to swing polls and swing voters over the next 5 weeks, do you think?
I think it could. I mean, he certainly is able to inject himself into the campaign whenever he likes, and we'll see what's going to happen and how the parties react to it. But there's definitely been a shift in how Canadians view Donald Trump. When he was elected back in November, there was still a vast majority of Canadians didn't like Donald Trump, but there was still about 20-25% who either approved of him or said they would vote for him. But we've seen over the last few months that his own numbers in Canada have really tanked. There's now 76% of people who say they have a negative opinion of him. I think it's just around 15 who have a positive. So we've seen that people's views of Trump has changed, and I think it changes how people viewed whatever he says now about Canada. So I think that he still has the ability to inject himself and move the polls a little bit, but it's especially about how the other party leaders are going to react to him and not necessarily what he says. If he says, if he endorses one of the candidates, I don't think that is going to move any votes.
Okay, you're a polls guy, but you're also a political junkie. So on a personal note, what are you going to be watching over the next couple of weeks from the juicy factor, not just the numbers factor, but what are you watching? Is it personalities? Is it where they stop? What is of most interest to you over the next 5 weeks?
I think it is mostly what Mark Carney's numbers are going to look like over the next little while. You look at the polling numbers when it comes to parties, but when it comes to how people perceive the leaders, that's often a leading kind of indicator. So if people turn on Mark Carney, we'll see that in his own numbers first, and then the Liberal Party will also drop. So really going to see how people react to him as they get to know him better. The other thing is just what are the NDP going to do? The NDP right now in our poll tracker are only at about 11%. The Conservatives can't win an election when the NDP is at 11%. So will the NDP get off the mat? And if they do, then we might have a very different election outcome. But if the NDP continue to have the kind of struggles they're having right now, that's probably good news for the Liberals.
Okay, Eric, this has been very helpful. Good luck with the tracker over the next 5 weeks. I'm sure we'll see more of you.
All right, thanks.
Eric Grenier is a polls analyst writing at therit.ca. He's also running CBC's poll tracker for this federal election. You can find that and more on cbc.ca/politics. So we've talked about how for decades, Saskatchewan has appeared to be a conservative province. That's how people have voted. But this will be an election like no other. There is momentum behind Carney and the Liberals. It's also possible that threats from the South could have an impact. To help us understand what all this could mean and how the West could have influence on this next election, we're joined by a partisan political panel. Doug Richardson is a Saskatoon lawyer. He spent 5 years in Ottawa and was the former chief of staff for Liberal Prime Minister John Turner. He's in our Saskatoon studio. Welcome to Blue Sky. We also have Caitlin Kitson. She's Caitlin Kitson, sorry, I keep missing the T in your name, is a conservative supporter from Yorkton. She's the owner of Kitson Strategic Solutions, and she's also a farmer. She also helped the Sask Party candidate in the Kenora Pelly area during the provincial election in October. She joins us now from Yorkton. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And Claire Card ran for the federal NDP in Saskatoon in 2021. She's joining us now from Saskatoon as well. Welcome, Claire.
Thanks, Sam.
So you've all been listening to the analysis, and I'm sure you've been following the campaign in its early stages. What do you make of the shift in polling since Trudeau resigned and Canada's been under the threat of Trump's administration? Doug, I'll start with you.
Well, it definitely is, as Eric pointed out, with the poll tracker, and I presume your audience all understands, Sam, the poll tracker is an amalgam of 10 polls, major polls, all of which have weighted according to their history of success in polling. But the poll tracker does show a slight edge for the Liberals at this point, which is remarkable considering, quite frankly, as a lonely Liberal in Saskatchewan, where we were about 2 months ago. The fact of the matter is all four of us on this panel know that elections matter. I would say that the campaign looks like today the three T's, tariff, Trumps, but most importantly, and Eric very briefly touched on it, the trust issue. What I could say one other thing that I know Paul a little better than Claire and Caitlin, but I'm sure Paul would agree with me. At the end of the day, what will be significant, and where shows like this, I would argue, and commend the CBC for doing this, what will be important is who gets out to vote. Mm-hmm. Very important that the turnout rises in this province. And I predict that the Liberals will only have a chance if young people get out and vote and women get out and vote. We saw what happened in the last provincial election where women voters increased the position of the NDP. The NDP support provincially could translate. So my point is the three T's are important, as Eric touched on, trust being maybe the most important, and whoever gets out to vote election day will be even more important.
Caitlin, you are a Conservative supporter in rural Saskatchewan, in an area that's been longtime Conservative. What do you make of the polling and the shift in attitudes nationally and maybe not provincially?
Yeah, so first I have to make the comment and disagree with our panelist about young women and women, voting. I would say, being a young woman and in this province of Saskatchewan and being a Conservative supporter, I think we're seeing more young people actually come to the Conservatives because we've lived through the Trudeau government. And I will say, they haven't made entering into our young professionals' young careers easy with, affordability, housing, crime rates, public safety. So I would say we're actually seeing more young people go Conservative because of the last, years of Trudeau. But I think right now, Mark Carney is the shiny new thing. And, we're going to see probably over the next 2 weeks that fade away. I would say he's one of the most boring politicians that I've ever listened to, and he's never been elected. So I think, this whole campaign is going to be really hard on him the next 5 weeks. And it's going to be interesting to see if he's going to be able to keep the momentum. Somebody, compared to Pierre Poilievre, who's been around the block a time or two. Definitely I wouldn't say it's rural, or I wouldn't say it's an east-western divide. It's more of a rural and urban divide. And that's always been kind of the struggle when it comes to Conservatives is they resonate with the rural people and, the energy, the agriculture, and the resource sectors. So, it's going to be interesting over the next 5 weeks to see what happens. But I don't think Carney's going to be able to keep being the shiny new thing for longer than a few weeks.
Caitlin, I just have a question for you because you said he's boring, but I'm wondering boring compared to who?
I would say, when you look at charisma, I would say Pierre Poilievre, definitely brings more charisma, and, than your Mark Carney. So I would compare them when it comes to, who can relate through social media nowadays. You're seeing a lot more Pierre Poilievre, videos, TikToks, Reels versus, Carney's long, boring speeches.
Okay. I want to go to Claire and give you an opportunity to respond because you've heard things from both sides here, Claire. But you did run federally for the NDP, and you did hear Eric say that the federal NDP is really struggling in the polls right now. What do you make of all of this?
Well, the federal NDP has been down in the polls before and then come back to be the official opposition. So it's definitely a challenge for us. I think it's correct to say that voter turnout, because many of the people who are NDP supporters, they tend to be folks that are working those shifts in the mines. They're people that happen to be healthcare workers who really struggle to get to, the voting polls. We recognize, I think, that the NDP will say things like Carney's an untested leader. He's a former asset manager of the Brookfield group. They were $1 trillion enterprise that did a lot with corporate land ownership and being landlords, where they managed to profit from renovictions of, the regular working people. And Poilievre has been using the same lines as Trump. So people are very hesitant, I think, right now rethinking their allegiance to the Conservative Party because they're hearing exactly the same phraseology coming out of him as we hear from Trump. So people are very concerned about those affordability issues. Anyone who goes to the grocery store can see the impact that the uncertainty is having right now, and people are a bit worried. And they're thinking, I think the NDP is going to support them better.
Caitlin, are you concerned? Is Trump, as a Republican leader, helping or hurting the Conservative Party right now?
It's a good question. And there's kind of two sides of it. I would say, probably not helping, but I don't know if he's doing as much damage as people are saying. I would say right now, it's more about the canola tariffs with China that I think is hurting the Liberals and kind of their little to no action on that standpoint. So I wouldn't say Trump's helping, but I don't know if he's harming us as much. Because right now I'm pointing, to the Liberal government of not having better relationships with Trump and the USA leading into this election.
Doug, did you want to you've been a chief of staff for a prime minister. Do you want to weigh in on that?
First of all, can I just correct something? Either I was misinterpreted or wasn't clear. I was responding to, Caitlin said that I said that young women were voting the Liberal Party. What I was saying is what will be important in the election is the voting of young people and women. And if you look at the provincial, we're trying to answer the question in relation to what Eric said. Secondly, on the canola issue, once again, Caitlin, you're not presenting all of the facts, and I say with respect, you may not have noted that the new Agriculture Minister, Kobe Boyes, who has a very good relationship with the Saskatchewan Agriculture Minister, announced a major additional help for the canola industry. The Agri-Stability Fund is being augmented. The levels are being increased, and the provincial government is being given the authority to administer that, the Saskatchewan provincial government. Secondly, the federal government announced half a year ago that $9 million was being provided to the canola industry, and the federal government has entered into a dozen different trading relations around the world to try to expand canola sales. That leaves even aside for the moment the changes that the farming industry has asked for and Minister Boyes has said he would seriously consider, and that has to do with advance payments. So all of these things are on the table. One last thing I'll bring to your attention. We were in this once before in 2018, 2019, and 2020. And here's a fact that none of your audience knows about and can talk about today. But in 2019, Prime Minister Trudeau flew to Saskatoon, met at the Besborough Hotel with Premier Wall and his wife, and offered Premier Wall the ambassadorship to China. They say most Canadians don't know about that. In the end, Premier Wall decided, as he should, to go back to his private life. So my point is the reason the offer of the ambassadorship was made was to try to deal with China. Lastly, in case you're unaware, Caitlin, Premier Rob Canoe asked NDP Premier, one of the best premiers in the country, I don't mind saying, NDP Premier Rob Canoe asked Prime Minister Carney, what will you do about China? And he promised to call President Xi and has undertaken to do that. So to sort of flippantly throw out that nothing's happening on canola is grossly unfair.
Okay. But I know we can go back and forth. I also want to bring in Paul Merriman. Paul is a former Saskatchewan Party MLA. He spent 13 years as an elected member of the legislature, serving in cabinet as Minister of Health, Social Services, and Corrections, Policing, and Public Safety. Paul, that's a long title. He now works as senior counsel with Prairie Sky Strategy, a consulting firm based out of Calgary, but he is still based in Saskatoon, as that is where he joins us from. Welcome to Blue Sky.
Thanks very much, Sam, and thanks for including me here today.
I love a good spicy debate, and that seems to be what we have here today. So I really appreciate you taking the time. But first of all, I want to get your take And I'm just going to focus on back and forth with you and I for a second, and then I'll bring everybody else back in. But I want to get your take on the polling that's happening. How much do politicians, I mean, you just went through the provincial election. You saw what happened with the polls. Do you pay attention to polls as a politician?
Did I? Yes. But the old adage is focus in on your constituency, focus in on your door knocking and what you can do. You can't control what the party's doing. You can't control the polls, but what you can control is who you are talking to on the doorstep, whether that be the farm gate or in business situations. That's what you should be focusing in on, not necessarily the polling, because you really, as a local candidate, don't have a lot of impact on that. But what you can do is go out, talk to people, knock on their doors, and find out what their issues are and relay that into the central campaign.
We've been talking a lot about the leaders today. We don't really expect Saskatchewan to be a hot campaigning stop. We haven't been historically. What are you expecting to see in terms of where the leaders will compete for votes, seats, attention?
Well, I think each leader in the party needs to relate to what's happening in Western Canada. There is a lot of angst in Western Canada. There has been for a few years now on how Western Canada can support the rest of the country, whether that be through equalization payments. But I think the most important thing that the leaders need to recognize is what the contribution of Western Canadian provinces is to the Canadian economy and how they can support that. It's very difficult for the Western provinces to produce, whether it be through agriculture or through oil and gas, uranium, how we get that product to the market, and then how we can maximize our benefit of those products. Some of the policies that have come out in the last few years have been very detrimental to Western Canada. And we need to understand that those are the policies that are inhibiting the growth of not just Western Canada, but the equalization payments for the rest of the country. We need to be able to look at how Western Canada can thrive in a global economy and support it.
We've already been hearing in Regina Conservative ads on the radio. Text messages are already coming into phones asking how you'll vote or if you'll support. How important is advertising during this time as someone who works in strategy now?
I think it's extremely important, whether you have that local advertising when you're driving down the street and you can see lawn signs out there of a particular color, whether they be red, blue, orange, or green. What does that make you feel like? Is everybody in your neighborhood voting this way? Then you have what's called the ground campaign, which would be billboards, and then the air campaign, which is radio, television, and obviously in the last dozen years to probably 15 years is the online campaign, which is reaching out to the younger voters. As Mr. Richardson pointed out, they need to be engaged. They need to understand that their vote does count. It is important for them to get out and vote because, in my opinion, if you don't get out and vote, then you really don't have a right to complain about what's going on. You have a voice, and if you go to a citizenship ceremony in Saskatchewan, which I'd encourage people to do, you understand how valuable our vote is and how people around the world work their whole life to be able to have a vote. And I think at some point in Canada, we've lost that ability to engage on our voters, and we need to have a good voter turnout on this election to be able to support all the candidates that are out there.
Prime Minister Harper is actually the one who appointed Mark Carney to be the governor of the Bank of Canada in 2008. Does this matter when Conservatives criticize Mark Carney?
I don't think so. I think Prime Minister Harper appointed who he needed at that point in time, but it wasn't just, you have to back it up from two individuals. This was also the finance minister. This was provincial ministers getting together to be able to weather the storm at that point in time. To narrow it down to two people, I don't think is fair. Did Mr. Carney help out Prime Minister Harper? Absolutely. But were there a lot of people in his cabinet and his advisors that helped him as well? Absolutely. And I think you have to broaden it out other than just the two names.
I think, let me be clear on that then, because I don't just mean Stephen Harper. I mean, at that time, you consider all the people that were involved, Finance Minister Jim Flaherty, the Conservative Party. No one gets appointed to the governor of Bank of Canada by one person. So by that extrapolation, there was a time that the Conservative Party did support Mark Carney.
I think they had faith in his abilities at that time to be able to help them weather the storm. And obviously, Mr. Carney went on to the Bank of London and other future endeavors. So the Conservative government and the Conservative cabinet and caucus obviously had faith in his ability to help at that point in time. Now, I think that was a very nonpartisan appointment for Mr. Carney to come out and now be on the Liberal side and say that he was the one that weathered the storm alone. I don't think that's fair either. I think that everybody that was in that situation has to be given credit for what they can do to help out in those economic challenges.
There's been a lot of animosity between the province of Saskatchewan and Ottawa under Justin Trudeau. That's not a secret. The assumption would be that Pierre Poilievre would work better with Scott Moe. Premier Moe just posted on X that voters should, quote, choose wisely. What would you say to someone who doesn't think that Premier Moe could or would criticize Poilievre as a prime minister?
Oh, I think Premier Moe will criticize anything that is not in the best interest of Saskatchewan, as Premier Wall did. And going back, there was lots of things that the province of Saskatchewan and Premier Wall at the time disagreed with Prime Minister Harper. There were disagreements. It wasn't just smooth sailing for the province of Saskatchewan. There were different challenges back then. I refer back to potash. There were some challenges in and around our province that we adamantly disagreed with the federal government under Prime Minister Harper. Now, in saying that, we also are always going to look out for Saskatchewan's best interest, no matter who is sitting in Ottawa, no matter what the political stripe is. We have to look out for the best interest of our province in supporting our economy, and that enables us to support people such in healthcare, social services, and education. If we don't have that economy working, it's very difficult to support the social side of our province.
What started as a, quote, making change election, change being getting rid of Justin Trudeau, has really morphed into a who will better manage the U.S. president election, at least in the short term. There's the Elbows Up campaign. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Something Mike Myers started on SNL that's kind of moved on to be a Canadian movement. But how do conservatives, particularly prairie conservatives, balance being right of center but not aligning with Donald Trump?
It's a very fine line, and I think Mr. Poilievre has done a reasonably good job of separating himself from the right movement of the Conservatives in America in criticizing Donald Trump, in coming out and being very critical of what those policies are going to do to Canadians, not just our economy, but our overall relationship with Americans is very strained right now. In a recent trip down to the U.S., there were people coming up to me apologizing for what was happening in Ottawa. Mm-hmm. They were apologizing to me as soon as I identified myself as a Canadian. I don't think that the public in the U.S. is supportive of taking on the Canadians. I think Mr. Trump has picked a couple of enemies, as he usually does. Last term, it was build that wall. Now it's tariffs, and tomorrow it could be something different. The long history of our two countries being together in trade, and not just in trade, but in wars, we have always been strong allies. Mr. Trump needs to back this off and be able to focus in on how we can complement each other versus attacking each other.
From a strategy standpoint, what do you make of Premier Moe announcing Saskatchewan will be joining that governor's coalition on energy security? It's a time when people are focused on interprovincial trade, Canada first, internal security. Is it odd that Saskatchewan and Alberta join forces with some U.S. states for this committee? Like, what are the optics of that?
This has been ongoing for a long time. There are lots of organizations from Canada that partner with the U.S. governors, partner with, whether it be through PENWAR, which is the Pacific Northwest. There's also the Midwest Legislative Conference. We have been working with legislators in the Midwest and on the West in where we have similarities. I think it's an extremely good strategy to engage with the governors, because the governors are going to have a bigger voice in Washington than certainly the premiers of Western Canada are. Those are the ones that have an impact on the vote for Donald Trump. Those are the ones that are going to have a bigger voice in talking to the senators and the congresspeople out there. They're the ones that are going to make sure that our voice is heard, because they can tell the economic impacts, the negative impacts in their own communities and their own states better than we can in Canada.
I do. I understand, like Penware, all of that. I know it's been going on for a long time, but the optics of announcing it now, that's what I'm asking about.
Well, the optics of announcing it now is, I think, just presenting that we are unified in our disagreement with what is happening in Washington. I think it's politically advantageous that Premier Moe has said that this is going to be a priority for him, because we're trying to manage a budget in Saskatchewan, and we have no idea what the impact on revenue is going to be. So we have to make those determinations as soon as possible. And if there's a conference that the premiers can go to be able to voice our opinion and get Ottawa to listen, I'm all for it. I think they need to be there no matter what their political stripe is. They need to represent their province, and they need to be able to have an active voice with the U.S., whether that's via the governors or directly through it with Washington. It's important to have it, and have it as fast as possible.
Paul, thanks so much for this. I want to go back to the panel now, who's sitting there politely while I have this conversation with you. Claire, I wanted to go back to you in conversations as we're talking about energy coalition. We know the issue with Canadian oil going down to the States, conversations with Premier Danielle Smith, seemingly aligned with Premier Scott Moe. But what do you make of this energy coalition and partnering with the States?
Well, it's a slippery slope. I think, people are very concerned about a relationship that might not work out for Canada. We are concerned, of course, that, people in the party very concerned about what will happen with the tariffs. That creates a lot of uncertainty for people. A lot of jobs in the province depend on oil and gas. I think people would be very hesitant to view that in a very positive manner at this point. I think Canada First is really what people are talking about, that we need to look after each other. We need to reduce the interprovincial trade barriers. We need to make sure that we can move our energy east and west and make sure that that fits with our environmental goals. So there's a lot of things at play right now.
Okay. Speaking of Canada First, patriotism is at an all-time high in Canada. I've never seen people so proud to be Canadian. This has gone beyond just putting the patch on your backpack when you're going on holidays. But Mark Carney has been wrapping himself in all things Canada. Last week, he was out skating with the Edmonton Oilers. This weekend, he put out an ad with Mike Myers. If you haven't seen it yet, it's two of them in a skating rink. They're leaning over the boards, wearing Canadian hockey jerseys. Have a listen.
Let's go. Mr. Prime Minister, Mike Myers, what are you doing here? I just thought I'd come up and check on things.
You live in the States?
Yeah, but I'll always be Canadian.
But you live in the States?
Yeah, so?
Do you remember Mr. Dressup?
The children's show on CBC?
What were the names of Mr. Dressup's two puppet friends?
Casey and Finnegan?
Bud the
Spud?
Howie?
Meeker?
Capital Saskatchewan?
Regina?
Tragically?
Pip?
You're a defenseman, defending a 2-on-1. What do you do?
Take away the pass, obviously.
What are the two seasons in Toronto?
Winter and construction.
Wow. You really are Canadian.
Yeah. But let me ask you, Mr. Prime Minister, will there always be a Canada?
There will always be a Canada.
All right. Elbows up.
Elbows up.
I'm assuming this is targeted at very specific people, hockey fans for one. Caitlin, as you're hearing it or watching it, what are you thinking?
Well, I think my first thought was, he's not from Canada and he's in your first advertisement. So, it's cheesy, I would say. So I think we laughed about it and kind of scrolled on it.
What do you mean he's not from Canada?
He currently doesn't reside in Canada, Mike Myers. So I think the comment was like, why doesn't he live in Canada? Why did he choose to move to the States and stay there? So I think that was my first comment when I had seen the video.
Okay. Doug, what about thoughts from the Liberal side of things?
Well, can I just go back for a second to something that Paul said on strategy, which does touch on the ads, and that is the fact that the Premier of Saskatchewan, because we're talking about Saskatchewan, Sam, has come out endorsing one candidate for the prime ministership of the country, and I think it's a huge mistake. And I'll tell you why. Premier Ford, who's become Captain Canada, speaking of nationalism, has very carefully walked a line. In the huge, massive win in 1984 by Brian Mulroney, Bill Davis was front and center supporting Mr. Mulroney. Premier Legault of Quebec has wisely stayed out of this. Premier Smith has injected herself into this campaign in a quasi-nationalism type of move in which she's indicated she's talked to officials in the United States and they feel that Americans are closer to their thinking at this time with the federal or with the party of Mr. Poilievre. So that's where I think it's risky for leaders to start at a provincial level to be picking choices for the prime ministership. I would argue it should be left to the electorate at the provincial level. That's what Premier Ford said. Sure, of course, I love the ad, but you'd expect me to say that to some degree.
What about you, Claire? What did you think of? I mean, we haven't seen a ton of TV ads yet, and I'm sure the attack ads are coming from all sides. But as one of the first ads, what did you think?
Well, I think it's what I expected. They're specifically going after a few targeted individual groups of voters, which is, understandable. And on the Mike Myers comment, I think Wayne Gretzky got some similar concerns based on his recent performances with the hockey. So similar concerns.
Caitlin, if the Liberals were to win another minority or even a majority government, what do you think that would mean for Saskatchewan and the West?
I think it's concerning for lots of our businesses and our industries out in the West. When we look at investment in the mining industry, investment in the agriculture industry, I know, and just to correct Doug's comment, I have a very good working relationship with Cody, and those are proposed changes to acre stability, but acre stability is already a broken program. Giving money to farmers to fix, that's not the issue of the problem. So I think it's really concerning when we look at our industries that support the West, energy, mining, resources, agriculture. I would be very scared of what that means for the future. And, we want to be Canada first, but I also think it's, we produce enough product that, we do need export markets. I know on our farm, most of our products don't stay within Canada, just, we produce commodities and they rely on those international markets.
Do you have concerns, though, about when we talk, and I know part of this is me asking the question about the West, but do you have concerns about Western alienation and concerns about a growing separatist movement then? Because then we lose Canada first and we become West first.
It's an interesting comment because I just had a conversation over the weekend with some friends, in the shop at the farm. And they're like, if the Liberals, get in, I think we need to look at separating. And we would have to take BC with us, I said. And I think BC would be hard to take with us because we need the port, right? We need Prince Rupert and the Port of Vancouver. So I said, we would have to get BC on our side. And I just don't know if that's realistic. But I think it is becoming, a conversation that is happening, in farmer shops or, I was at Canada's farm show, big farm show in Regina all week. And it was a conversation I heard farmers talking about if, the Liberals do get elected, what do we do as an industry? Because they haven't been on our side since day one. Do we think that will change?
Doug, you've been through, with John Turner as leader of the opposition and also as prime minister, through some of this. This is not the first time that separatist conversations have come up. How do you respond to that conversation every time? Because it comes up every election.
It's disappointing, and it's really frustrating that Caitlin would raise this, quite simply. When Prime Minister Mulroney won the most massive win in the country after Mr. Diefenbaker's, the net result of having too big a win on too far a side was that the Reform Party kicked up in Western Canada and the Bloc in Quebec. And I would argue that it's better and healthier if we have elected people for all parties from all across the country. And so I would hope that the Liberal Party does make a bit of an improved show in Saskatchewan. I'm not fooling myself of the uphill ride we've got. But to take an attitude that, well, if the election just doesn't happen to go our way, we're going to talk about separating the country. Frankly, it's an embarrassing statement and I hope isn't getting attached. What's interesting is that Paul mentioned the question of equalization, and equalization is something that does need addressing. I would acknowledge that. I know that premiers have talked about it. To the credit of Prime Minister Harper, he agreed that he would try to address it. The difficulty is the hydroelectric issue in Manitoba and Quebec. Otherwise, it may be addressed. But there are a myriad of things. Look, the show isn't quite long enough, Sam, but
I know I'm watching the clock and going, we could talk about this for hours.
No, but I take umbrage with the suggestion that the government does nothing about the West. That's just factually wrong. I touched on agriculture. On the oil and gas sector, it's a Liberal government against the environment strain, and I know that's upset NDP supporters, but built a pipeline across Canada. Prime Minister Harper was the best supporter of the oil and gas industry, and he built no pipelines in 9 years. The federal government's completed part of one and built another one. So to suggest, and here's another thing that's not well known and has made life very difficult for me when people say what Caitlin said. The federal government, through the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, has provided more money to the University of Saskatchewan than any university in Canada. The federal government provided $25 million to hydrology, $92 million to synchrotron, $65 million to, or $56 million to Vito, $100 million, just getting off of that for a second, $100 million to BHP to build the largest green mine in the world. Frankly, the list is quite lengthy, and Caitlin and others get away with things like this without fully addressing the facts.
Okay, before, I know you two can go back and forth, and I love it, but I just want to ask Claire before we go, and we don't have a lot of time, Claire, so I'll ask you to keep this brief, but I'm wondering about potential for NDP to gain any support here in Saskatchewan. We saw that happen in the provincial election. We have had federal NDP MPs here before. Any thoughts on that before we go?
Yeah, I think that's a real possibility, particularly in Saskatoon West and in the North. Clearly, we hear a lot of people concerned about, besides the tariffs, about things like, I might get a tax cut, but I'm going to pay more for my health care. I've got a government that's not going to support me in terms of getting any daycare that's regulated spaces, that they're not going to support dental care. So people see all these pocketbook issues piling up. They're not going to get that from either the Conservatives, in any stripe, and they're not going to get these core issues addressed for some of the ridings. The Indigenous people in the North still don't have clean water. The people in the core of Saskatoon really struggle with the problems with unhoused folks and addiction issues. So these things have not been addressed for years. I think the NDP is the party that's going to do the most for the people locally that live in those locations.
Well, I have to say, this has been such an interesting hour of conversation. I appreciate all of you for your thoughtfulness and your respectfulness. And I would love to do this again in a couple of weeks if you guys are game, as the things can change. We know that on a whim, especially as we deal with the interesting situation in the United States. Maybe there'll be tariffs, maybe there won't. It seems to be different every week. But I have really appreciated the conversation and the time you guys have put in today. Doug Richardson is a Saskatoon lawyer who spent 5 years in Ottawa. He was the former chief of staff to Liberal Prime Minister John Turner. Caitlin Kitson is a business owner and conservative political strategist. She's also a farmer in the Yorkton area. And Claire Card is a former NDP candidate in Saskatoon. Paul Merriman also spent some time with us. He is a former Saskatchewan Party MLA, now working as senior counsel with Prairie Sky Strategy, a consulting firm based out of Saskatoon. I feel like the show needed to be 2 hours long. Thank you all for your time this afternoon. Obviously, we have lots to talk about as we get closer towards Election Day. That is on April 28th. Of course, you can get the latest news here at cbc.ca/sask for everything happening in Saskatchewan politics. And we will have a mailbag tomorrow. If we didn't get to your email, or if you leave us a message on TalkBack, 1-800-661-7540, or send us an email or a voice note even to bluesky@cbc.ca. I just couldn't interrupt these guys. They were too good.